Okay, so thank you everyone for joining us here tonight. I'm glad that Bonnie posed that question to begin with, because it was the first question that I was going to ask you, and I honestly, I don't have an answer, so I'm glad that we started off with some answers. I don't have an answer for this one either, which is obviously which came first, the chicken or the egg. And I certainly don't have an answer for this one, because I'm not a cook and I don't understand anything about the kernel. So we're not going to focus on those difficult questions. Today we're actually going to focus on these more straightforward questions, and that is, why do I find chickens so terrifying? And why should we care about chickens, given that they are so terrifying? Okay, so we'll start off with the easy one. Why am I terrified of chickens? I finished my bachelor's degree in zoology, and as part of that degree, I came to the conclusion that I much rather enjoyed looking at the fascinating outsides of animals as opposed to their gooey insides. And so, behavioral studies were a good match for what I wanted, and that's what I was looking for. I ended up doing my PhD on chickens, but what I really wanted to do my PhD on was cheetahs. And there was a great PhD project in the Serengeti, 2 years in the Serengeti. Fabulous. Now, why cheetahs? Well, it's obvious. Cheetahs are a cool and sexy animal. They run over 200 miles an hour. They live in packs of 20. They can bring down a full-grown elephant by themselves. Okay, I didn't actually end up studying cheetahs, so some of those facts probably not entirely true, but I'm not a cheetah expert, so there you go. And potentially one of the reasons that I didn't get the cheetah PhD was, at that point in time, my only experience working with animals was with the not-so-carnivorous bank vole in a nicely air-conditioned lab. And so I kind of understand why perhaps I wasn't chosen out of all the other people who were chosen. So the PhD that I did get was at the University of Oxford under Professor Marion Dawkins, and it was looking at the welfare of laying hens. She had a couple of projects, one on laying hens, one on broiler birds, which are the meat birds. And we sort of have to face it. Chickens are not a cool and sexy animal from most people's perspectives. And so it's possible that they're so anti-cool and anti-sexy that they become nerdy cool, but I don't know. So I'd never actually interacted with chickens prior to starting my PhD, and I sort of tried to convince myself that this wasn't going to be an issue, that it was going to give me a fresh and objective perspective as to how I could meet the needs of these animals. I was less convinced when I walked into the chicken barn for the first time, and they all started making this Bruce Lee noise at me, which is sort of a which is actually very intimidating when you've never sort of been up close with a chicken. So that was kind of scary. The group of graduate students at Oxford who worked with chickens, they took turns every weekend to go down and clean out the chicken pens, to feed the birds, to collect the eggs. And the technician who was running me through the process of doing this made some offhand remark about the fact that I should watch out for my eyes when I was collecting the eggs. I said, my eyes? Because of all the sawdust and stuff? And he's like, no, it's because chickens like to peck at shiny things. I'm rather fond of my eyes. I kind of enjoy being able to see. So it wasn't too unusual to find me early on a Saturday morning, slightly hungover, to be honest, collecting chicken heads somewhat like this and trying not to be pecked in the eye. To my credit, I still have both my eyes, so whatever I was doing was actually the right thing to do. From this time onwards, I guess I had a more of a cautious respect for chickens. And part of this, to be fair on the chickens, was based on the sobering reality that over the next 3 years, all of my work, all of my research was in the beaks of these eye-gouging, leg-hair-pulling chickens. And out of my control, basically. You do a PhD on chickens, and it's not long before people start calling you the chicken man. And they start buying you chicken-themed gifts for every occasion, such as this delightful tie that I got. I think I was kind of better off than one of the graduate students who was a couple of years ahead of me. His name was Richard Deeth. Because working on chickens and also being Dr. Death kind of sounds like a recipe for disaster. So I probably got off lucky from that perspective. But I did work with chickens for 3 years, and to be honest, there wasn't a dull moment working with them. I met my wife at Oxford. She was studying anthropology and doing a PhD, and one of the first stories that she told me was about chickens and her family. And she had first-hand experience where her dad was given some chicks, and he thought, well, we'll rear these in the back garden, we'll get some eggs for the family. But he knew nothing about chicks. He didn't know how to tell the difference between a rooster and a hen, didn't know if he needed a rooster to have eggs. And he was convinced that after the raccoons basically wiped out half of the chicks because they just left them in the garden, that all he was left with were 4 roosters. And he was also convinced that one of his daughters was putting eggs in there from the shop just to gaslight him, that one of them was a female. What he did actually have was 3 roosters and 1 lone hen, Rita, who lived a somewhat short and violent life, being the center of attention for 3 randy roosters. And I think this well-intentioned but borderline disastrous situation is probably rather common in the back gardens across this country. Because for anyone not living on a farm, chickens are probably the only species that we're sort of able or willing to have, a food-producing species that we're willing to care for in our own back gardens. And whether it's because of the state of the economy or the food scares that you hear about in the news, or simply because we want to have more connection with the food that we eat, there's been a sort of an increasing demand for wanting to rear your own chickens. And that's led to some cities to have ordinances preventing you from doing that in residential neighborhoods and things like that. So it's an ongoing trend that we're seeing. And yet, as much as people feel willing to keep chickens, I think there's still a bit of a mystery to us. We feel that they should be familiar. They're on our buildings. They decorate our crockery. They're omnipresent at Easter. And yet, when we take a closer look at them, we really don't know an awful lot about them, because we assume that we do, and actually we don't. Mark and I were both involved in writing chapters for this book. And one of the purposes of this book was to provide scientifically based evidence and practical suggestions about how one can take on the challenge of rearing chickens, whether for food or for pets or for showing them in competitions. And so, the suggestions that we came up with are based on the great multitude of science that exists out there, which leads us to another question. Why is there so much research on chickens? And that takes us back to this question, which is, why should we care about chickens? So let me go through some reasons why I think we should care. First of all, numbers. Chickens outnumber humans by over 3 to 1. So right now on this planet, there could be over 20 billion chickens that exist here. And obviously that means that this can be a very profitable market. And that explains a lot of the research. They want to make chickens more efficient, more effective, healthier, so that they can continue to produce. The next reason. The next viral pandemic that wipes out and devastates humanity is probably going to start its life in an intensively reared animal. And so, a deadly strain of avian flu that crosses from a wild bird into humans is probably going to begin its life in a chicken. The chicken entrails were once used to divine the future. And I think the irony is that they themselves might be the harbingers of our doom. Very, very depressing. On the flip side to that, most of the flu vaccines that are made today are still made in this rather archaic way of injecting influenza into an egg, letting the virus multiply, harvesting the virus, and then making the vaccine from that. So chickens might be the cause of the next thing that wipes out humanity, but they also may be the thing that saves us to a certain extent. And it takes about 3 eggs to make a single dose of vaccine in this way. The reason that there are so many chickens around is that the vast majority of people on this planet consider them to be in some way tasty. And if we look at what the average American eats in a year, that's quite a lot of chickens. But chickens didn't start off their relationship with us as food. They were often thought to be used for ceremonial processes, religious ceremonies, and for cockfighting and for different types of blood sports. Until someone cottoned on to the idea that you could actually eat them, and they were tasty. Although dogs and sheep and goats and cows have been domesticated for longer than chickens, chickens are the first avian species that we domesticated. And that means that they bring with them this evolutionary heritage that goes all the way back to the dinosaurs. So that's a very fascinating thing to think about. And this is perhaps the most important reason for today, is that they are cognitively complex. They're not just mindless nugget and egg producing machines. They are, they do still possess the same cognitive abilities and behaviors shown by their wild ancestors out in the wild. And I think, no matter your opinion on the role that chickens play in society, in human society, they can be a fascinating species. So using some of the examples from the book and from other examples, Mark and I are going to help explore some of the lesser known nooks and crannies of the natural history of chickens. And we have to remember that these are animals that have been artificially selected to such a degree that they are at the limits of what they can produce in terms of eggs and meat. That they are in fact extremely efficient feeders. They can turn low quality food into high quality food, which is why they're such a great food source. That they are the mainstay of our breakfast and baking industries and all those vaccines that I just talked about. That they have these inner thoughts and feelings that we can explore. And so they're a behaviorally complex animal, and Mark's going to take this on, and we'll see that once we take a closer look at the inner and outer workings of these animals, they are a fascinating species to see. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Mark, and then we'll be back some more to talk about some cognitive abilities.
Thanks a lot, Joseph. That's a hard act to follow. So I will try and make sure that you guys are still with us. I'm not a Prezi presentation person, so here's your PowerPoint. And Bonnie wanted to start us about what we're doing here and sort of how did we get involved in writing this book in the first place. And I can tell you the highly scientific reason for it, or I can tell you that I was working on another book, and the publishers said, "Oh, while we're figuring out your contract, can you also write a chapter on the chicken?" And it was January, and I wasn't teaching, and I said, "Sure, I know lots about chickens, but I have to tell you about what I actually do know about and what I don't know about." In any case, the book is quite fascinating and amazing. Our chapters are based on science. I actually have no idea who the other authors are. I know that we got involved because somebody actually dropped out of the team, and I said, well, I know a lot about behavior, so I'm going to write the behavior chapter. And I know the chicken guy who teaches at my school, and he studies amazing aspects. He actually did his PhD on the chicken. So Joseph Barber wrote the chapter on intelligence, and was a general editor for the whole book. And once, actually, he only saw the book today. I have my own copies that I'm mailing to my mother, so please don't take it. But the book is actually quite amazing, and it's $17. So we are really excited. It was a fascinating process to write a book on something so common and so esoteric in some ways. But by the end of my segment of the talk, I think I will be able to answer both of the questions, which came first, the egg or the chicken, and also why the chicken crossed the road. So I do this. I work at Hunter, and I get to teach in the Animal Behavior and Conservation program. And it's because I study weird and remote things that live far away places. Obviously, I am not a native US person. I was born in Hungary, but I actually had a previous job before Hunter in New Zealand, and I studied birds that are at the brink of extinction. In North America, if a bird species is less than 10,000 individuals in numbers, we consider it, endangered or threatened. In New Zealand, that number is 200. And so when the number reaches, for instance, the flightless kakapo, 200, the Department of Conservation drops funding for it. So when you talk about conservation in this country versus in other areas of the world, you have to think about context and number. And so when we talk about 20 billion chickens, you have to ask other kind of questions. But I work on all kinds of birds. I work on eggs. I work on seabirds. I work on sort of psychedelic feathers here and other things. But my favorite organisms are sort of the exception to the rule. We actually learn a lot about birds when we are studying ornithology in undergraduate and graduate classes through the chicken. You look at the embryonic development, you look at the structure of the egg, the structure of the feather. And then you look at 1% of the birds, avian species in the world, there's about 10,000 of them, which do this thing. They actually lay their eggs in other birds' nests, unlike the chickens. And these birds are called brood parasites, the cowbirds of North America, the cuckoos of Europe. And I asked this question. If I study something so cognitively complex, such as a flycatcher like the phoebe or a redstart, which is also a flycatcher in Europe, what are these birds thinking raising somebody else's kid? Why can they find out that that egg does not belong to them, the female didn't lay it, and more importantly, this chick can actually swallow the entire foster mother right here. My salary only depends on telling the difference between a cowbird and a phoebe, but the evolutionary fitness, the Darwinian fitness of this poor phoebe depends on telling the difference between a parasite and its own young. So if I can tell the difference, how come that the phoebes can tell the difference? In North America, it's absolutely fascinating because the cowbird eggs, the parasite eggs, are actually so different that you and I can tell just by looking at a simple photo. In Europe, it's a little more difficult. You know, they've got more history. And so this is the cuckoo egg here, this is the cuckoo egg here, and the cuckoo egg there. You know, you can imagine that the cuckoo and the host have had longer history to, you know, sort of come up with this kind of mimicry. But again, you know, if you have a spectrophotometer, which is just a fancy way of measuring color of the eggs or the size of the eggs, you can tell the difference. So why are these birds not being able to tell the difference when they are so good at other things? And I'm going to show you this video, which is not about the chicken, but some of these brood parasites have been called the parasitic chickens because they have forgone the duty of parental care and they actually lay as many eggs as a chicken would do. A cowbird can lay an egg about every other day during the span of the whole summer. Cuckoos can lay 10, 12 eggs in a row without taking care of the young. But when you're thinking about these cognitive complexities, you know, why do you have something that can find a nest box, can build a beautiful nest, and then withstand something like this happening to her own eggs? So this is a female redstart in Finland in a nest box, and that's a young cuckoo chick right there doing what it does, which is tossing out the eggs of mom. And mom, who has just traveled from sub-Saharan Africa to this Finland breeding site, to this nest box that she had used in the previous year, looks as if she had absolutely no interest in her own reproductive success being decimated by this blind and naked cuckoo chick. So when you talk about cognitive complexities, you have to talk about the context in which we're looking at this. And you know, this is a tiresome process, but mom doesn't take that egg back. And so when I study these birds, these are the questions I ask. How can you fly from Ithaca, which is where I studied the phoebes, to the coast of the Gulf and then fly back to the exact same nest? I mean, these birds build their nest on the same windowsill, 3,000 miles, and then not tell the difference between a speckled egg and a white egg. How can you reconcile these different aspects of complexity? And just like anybody who studies chickens will get the chicken jokes, I get the jokes about the bird brain. You know, what's going on in this little brain, which is an amazing capacity, which has an amazing capacity to be able to tell the difference between, you know, two buildings that look identical, or 1,000 miles of migratory path, but cannot tell the difference between a speckled egg and an unspeckled egg. And I just wanted to show you the last sort of example before we talked about the chicken is that it's because brood parasites are, you know, sort of treacherous and they are playing their own trickery themselves. So the eggs in Europe are mimetic, and you know, I challenge you to find the egg of the cuckoo in some of these cases. But what happens also, if I'm just going to point out the cuckoo egg here, the cuckoo egg here, and the cuckoo egg here, it takes some practice. When I moved from North America to Europe, back to Hungary to study these birds, I had a hard time telling the cuckoo egg apart. In Africa, the strategy is very different. The nestlings, the gate markings of the chick, this is the parasite, this is the host, are identical and very different from the nearest relatives. And what happens in New Zealand is visually these chicks are very different, but listen to these begging calls. This is the host, and this is the cuckoo. You might say, oh, that just sounds like a begging call of any bird. But listen to this other host. And then listen to this cuckoo. Frequency-wise, it's exactly the same. It's a little more intense because the cuckoo chick is hungrier, feed me more. But the frequency range is exactly the same. So there's visual trickery, there's acoustic trickery, there's behavioral trickery. And when you're a behavior ecologist and conservation biologist, you want to make sure that people pay for your travel. You know, God forbid you paid to visit your mom on your own. So you get research grants to study cuckoos in Hungary. You get research grants to study parasitic birds in the southern hemisphere, so you avoid the winter. and you get to travel throughout the Pacific to be able to travel to all these sites, especially when you're from Hungary. You know, Karl Marx was, you know, obviously influential during my early childhood there, you know, it was a nice way to get away from there. So this is, of course, where my own history with chickens begin. This is a Hungarian fairy tale where I was acting as a 4-year-old kindergarten person, and I am playing the roar of the rooster, and the rooster outwits the Turkish Sultan in 3 different tasks. So the Sultan obviously wants to get rid of this rooster, but this rooster swallows a whole bunch of honeybees, gets away from fire, and I can't remember the 3rd task, but he wins over the Turkish Sultan, who is, of course, disgraced by this very clever rooster. So this is you know, my somewhat underappreciated past as an actor. But afterwards, I did, you know, decide that I wanted to study birds for my career, and so, as Bonnie pointed out, I moved from Yale to Cornell to Berkeley to New Zealand. New Zealand is also good for birds because, much like your pets, New Zealand birds have evolved in the absence of mammalian predators. So they just think you're a rather large bird who's not going to harm them. This bird is one of those endangered species. There's 214 of them. It's a takahe. His name is Greg, and he's very good at finding food in your backpack on a remote island. But after all this, you come back to Hunter, and you start sort of reevaluating your life of, you know, am I going to work on ducks? Am I going to work on remote birds? Am I going to lose some weight, perhaps? Or, you know, am I going back to acting since I only live 2 blocks from Broadway itself? What I actually end up doing is I continue working with students, and we end up publishing about amazing variety of birds. And occasionally I do my own work, which was in the case of working on the chicken book. I have, you know, I'm in a psychology department, and so I have actually published on how people are very much like fruit flies and meerkats and starlings. It was actually an article I wrote about famous movie stars, if you're ever interested. But here we are, back to the chicken, chapter number 3, behavior. And so what does a person who studies cowbirds and cuckoos know about chicken behavior? And what I had mentioned before is that we all know about chicken behavior because that's where it all starts. That's where our initial knowledge had come from. It's the longest domesticated bird that we have, and it's the standard for developmental studies, and it still represents a lot of mysteries. And before there was chicken and natural history, there was the natural history of the chicken, a PBS home video. And so if you search for these titles, you actually get a really nice New York Times review of this DVD, also available on Amazon.com, and it's about 60 minutes of fun. But there wasn't a book based on mostly scientific and also cultural interpretations of the behavior of the chicken until the book came around. And so here's my answer to the first question, which is, why did the chicken cross the road? The answer is, it was running away from a predator, of course. There was a predator on either side of the patches. And when you studied red jungle fowl, which is the ancestral chicken, in Sri Lanka, for instance, or India and Southeast Asia, this is as much of a chicken you will see as you can get. They are jungle fowl, and so they live in dense undergrowth. They don't fly really well, just like the modern chicken. And so the most time you see them is when they cross the road from one patch of forest to the next patch of forest. I do want to point out that many varieties of modern chicken look exactly like the red jungle fowl. And so this is a domesticated rooster, and this is a red jungle fowl right there. But in a lot of cases, you know, these 10,000 years of domestication have not been that dramatic for a lot of the behaviors, a lot of the phenotypes, a lot of the appearances of the birds. So today, our roosters who are allowed to be living in the backyard, we're not talking, of course, factory processed animals, have very much the same mating system. A single dominant rooster, his job is to make sure that no other roosters get access to his little harem of hens. Because the hens actually pay attention. If that rooster is being challenged, they will be less likely to approach him. These females pay a lot of attention to not only the other females, which we'll talk a little bit about, dominance hierarchies, but also the male. If the male is being challenged, these females are eavesdropping on his losing battles, and he will be the unsuccessful one. The social order is still maintained. The multiple hands within that social group are maintaining their hierarchies. And in fact, when you have a new individual coming in, she has to fight her way into the group itself, and we'll talk a little bit about cooperation. The parenting system is still the same. Male rooster doesn't do anything. The females take care of the young, except he does do things. He alerts to danger. He alarm calls. He alarm calls to the whole group, and he's more likely to alarm call when there are chicks and hens around than when there's a male rooster. So he pays attention. We call this the audience effect. If I was in this room alone, I probably wouldn't be talking or wouldn't be motivated to talk, or somebody would take me away because I was talking in a room on my own. The rooster does exactly the same thing, except he pays attention to competitors too. If he sees a hawk and there's only another male rooster, or in an experimental situation, the video image of a male rooster out there, he will stay quiet. He will call, on the other hand, if there's a female rooster, and he doesn't really care if she's familiar or not, because male roosters are just like many other males, interested in all kinds of females, not just the ones they have seen recently. So, what do? They roost. They keep safe from predators. There's a whole section in the chapter which is about selfishness. And when you talk about evolutionary background and genetic sort of contributions, you have to talk about selfishness. We're all selfish because we're 100% related to ourselves, and our genes most benefit when 100% of these copies survive to reproduction, survive to breeding, survive to being the dominant individual. So when you can't fly really well, what you do is you climb up a little ladder, or you roost in a natural tree, and Joseph will talk about the importance of roosting. This is a behavior that has stayed with our chickens throughout domestication, and makes them happier perhaps at the end of the night. But what do you do when you're a selfish individual? You see a hawk or you see a fox, you hide. It doesn't really work when you're a domesticated hen and you hide in green vegetation with your white plumage, but you hide anyways, hoping that somebody else will keep those predators out of the backyard. But what modern chickens still do, which is a lot of other birds do, is they actually divide their hemispheres, their brain hemispheres, for different functions. And so in the book I point out, if you ever look at a baby chick, make sure you see which eye it uses before it pecks on the ground. And in more than 50% of the cases, it will probably use its right eye to look at a pebble or look at a grain of food before it pecks on it. At the same time, it can use its left eye to look for predators. Or if you're a rooster or a hen, look for competitors, look for social challenges. So you can use your two eyes for different functions, and it's much like chickens don't have hands. They have lateralization, which is just sidedness. They are right-sided or right-eyed for their food-related task, and they are left-eyed for their prey and so predator avoidance and social challenge type of tasks. And it all comes from the embryonic stage, because when you're inside the egg, just before you hatch, only one of your eyes, the right eye, is exposed to light. The left eye is sort of facing towards the inside of the egg, and that initial difference in light exposure causes this kind of lateralization. If you're a mean scientist and you take a poor egg and put it in entire darkness just before it hatches, it will not have the development of this lateralized eye function. If you expose that egg just 6 hours of light, it will have the lateralized eye function. And what actually the embryos do is they manipulate mom. Just before they hatch, they call to the mom, and mom stands up over the eggs. She rotates the eggs around, and during those rotations, the eyes are exposed to the light, and this lateralization develops. When you talk about selfishness, it's the kind of exciting aspect of selfishness, making sure that you're a fully functioning chick when you hatch out of the egg that makes you a successful individual. Another thing about chickens that we'll all know is, of course, living in groups. And when you live in groups, you can tackle more danger. You can tackle a snake, which would potentially be a danger for you. But if there's 7 or 8 of those beaks that almost got Joseph's eye during his PhD, you can imagine that that snake is better off running away, or sort of sliding away from you. And so mobbing is a communal activity. And we call it cooperation, because a single individual cannot do it, but a group of individuals accrues more benefit from working together. And of course, you call the other individuals together. You sort of alert the predator of your presence, but then again, if there's more of you to fight off those predators, the cooperation works. And chickens, of course, have proto-language. They have what we call referential alarm calls. We used to think that only humans have language. And then, of course, you have to decide, well, what is language in the first place? Language is defined, typically defined as a human system of communication, but just take away the human and think of, how does it translate to other animals too? Language is a system of communication that uses arbitrary signals to communicate shared meaning or commonly understood meaning. So if you have something called a referential alarm call, where one type of vocalization denotes the fact that there's a hawk flying above you, and when you hear that call, you actually look up. And when you have a ground predator type of alarm call, this is not the sound of a fox, and this is not the sound of a hawk. It's an arbitrary signal, and yet it signals the same meaning to all chickens in the backyard. When there's the ground predator call, you will look around at the ground level itself. And this is the notable work of Chris Evans, who just recently passed away in Australia, but he worked with Peter Marler and other animal cognition experts, showing that chickens are just as smart or just as likely to have these referential alarm calls and proto-language type of communication signals as vervet monkeys. Joseph's home institution, University of Pennsylvania, has the vervet monkey research group where they have shown that these monkeys actually have 3 different kind of referential vocalizations. They have one for snakes, one for leopards, and one for the eagles. Although I'm going to say that the leopard one is actually not referential because it sounds like the bark of a leopard. So, these monkeys are not smarter than the chickens themselves. But I will say that some of the cowbird hosts, those parasite hosts like the yellow warbler, also has a referential alarm call. When a small bird like this nests in a sort of vulnerable a nest like this, when you see and hear an alarm call about a predator, the best thing is to fly away from that nest. Do not expose your nest to the predator, because chances are the blue jay will just come and eat all your eggs. But what do you do when there's a cowbird? The male actually calls to the female and says, there's a cowbird in the environment. And what the female does is, instead of flying off, she actually sits on the nest and prevents the cowbird from physically laying the egg. She will still come in and tries to lay an egg on the back of the female, and it promptly falls off, and the cowbird is unsuccessful, and the young warbler, the warbler parents don't have to feed a foreign chick later on. So birds are just as smart as primates, and I'm just going to put that out there. So, what is the special meaning in referential alarm calls? Well, as I mentioned, if there's an empty cage in the experimental setup, or a male, a competitor, or a heterospecific like a bobwhite, there's no alarm calling. The male doesn't call, but he will call if his familiar group members are there, the females, the chicks, or even the images or the sounds of females and the chicks in the group. And of course, this benefits because chances are those chicks are his own babies. Chances are those females are going to be his mates with whom he's going to be siring young. And so selfishness translates into these seemingly altruistic behaviors, because at the end of the day, all that matters is how many gene copies are passed on to the next generation. So flock formation is critical for chickens because they are able to withstand some of these dangers that they wouldn't be able to withstand otherwise. Of course, it's hard to join a group of chickens because you already have alliances formed, and so if you come in as sort of the gamma or the zeta hen in the group, you're not very well off. You will have the last pick of the grains. you will have the last chance to drink. For males, it's even more serious. You have to make sure you are the only male, the only rooster in the group. And so the fights between the males are much more vicious, much more aggressive than the fights between the females. But the females still keep on fighting with each other. And what we call this behavior is policing. You should never take a status quo for granted. You should always poke a little bit. If somebody's super nice to you, every now and then you should just, make them do something to see if they're still nice to you. And the reason for that is because the simplest way cooperation can work in groups like human societies or chicken societies is called tit for tat. You should be nice to a stranger. That's the first rule. Anytime you encounter somebody, give them the benefit of the doubt. And then once they were nice to you, be nice to them again. And that's what the basis of cooperation is. If they are mean to you the first time, forget about it. Just don't do anything to them, or run away, and make sure that other people know that they are mean as well. That's not going to yield cooperation. Cooperation works by the simplest rule, which is be nice the first time and then reciprocate what you have received afterwards. And that's how many societies, very simple societies, evolve these highly structured group living scenarios by this very simple rule. In fact, people have put out computer challenges to come up with a more complicated rule of how you generate cooperation between individuals, and nobody has come up with a better rule. There's modification. You should be nice twice before you become mean, or give longer benefits of doubts. But really, the simplest one is the most successful one. And so, as behavior ecologists, we are of course obsessed about sex. And chickens provide plenty of this. Of course, if you study them in Sweden, where sex is, of course, everywhere, you end up disturbing them while sex is happening. And this is, of course, a difficult task because bird sex lasts about 3 seconds. This is not, most birds don't have an intermittent organ. And so what they have is a cloacal kiss, and it doesn't last very long. And so what this poor research student is doing is actually collecting the sperm before it's passed on from the rooster to the hen, because it turns out that male roosters are not as cocky as we think they are. The females care about mating. They don't want to be mated too many times, like Joseph mentioned, because it's a physically challenging mating process. The male has to stand on top of you and pull your feathers, and so you get hurt and damaged, and infections. And remember, you don't want to mate with too many different males because, birds also have STDs, and so the females pay attention to those things too. But what turns out, and which was sort of the discovery of the last 10 years, is doing this rather awkward, intrusive process, the males actually care about whether they had mated with somebody or not. And when they mate with an unfamiliar hen, they surely invest more sperm. They invest more viable sperm and just more sperm in general than when they are mating with somebody with whom they had mated before. So the males are choosy too, because at the end of the day, sperm is not, sort of unlimited, especially when you have 4 or 5 hens in your group, and they are interested in laying, 10, 12 fertile eggs at the end of the day. The only other thing I wanted to mention is that, remember, sex chromosomes in birds function differently or are associated differently with the sexes. And so the males have identical chromosomes. They kind of have an XX type of system. ZZ is what we call their sex chromosome. And the females are the heterogametic. ZW are the sex chromosomes. So they are kind of the XY. So when you talk about mating systems of mammals versus birds, you have to keep that in mind. And the last thing I wanted to mention is of course, parenting. What do the chicks want, and why do they want these things? The chicks are selfish. They are only 50% related to mom. They're 50% related to the dad, who doesn't provide much other than alarm calling. And so they are selfish when they seek out food, warmth, and safety. They are also competitive. Even though their siblings are 50% related to them, at the end of the day, you want to be the higher ranked hen. And at the end of the day, you want to be the only male. So, by being selfish for seeking food, warmth, and safety, you want to make sure that you're the one who survives, and you're the largest one who survives at the end of of the dependent period. But they still rely on cooperation. And how do they come about cooperating with each other? Remember, most birds can only lay a single egg a day, and so the female doesn't start incubating until the last egg or the second to last egg, the penultimate egg in the clutch. What the chicks do is they want to make sure that there are other ones that are in the group. Being safety in numbers is beneficial for the chicks, because if there's 15 of you or 5 of you, your chances are the fox is not going to get you, but somebody else in the group. So they coordinate. They actually talk to each other. They chirp inside the embryo. They chirp to the mom to rotate the eggs, but they also chirp to each other. Are you ready? Are we going to hatch tomorrow? And this is actually a CT scan of an embryo. This is a paper just last May from Current Biology, where scientists have done X-ray tomography to show that the brain of the chicks, when you play other chicks' calls or other or hens' calls, actually gets activated while hearing those sounds. And we're actually doing the same thing here at Hunter. I have a paper on, of course, the cuckoos and their hosts doing the same thing, but we want to make sure that this embryonic communication happens. And that's why a lot of scientists are studying birds, not because they're amazingly cute and super beautiful and complex, but because when you study embryos, you don't want to study it inside a rat or a sheep, which is what New Zealanders do apparently. You want to study it independently of the female, so you don't actually hurt the female, which is important for ethical considerations for animal research. And also you can manipulate the egg. You could give it more sounds or less sounds. You could work with siblings without actually hurting the embryo. And so I'm very excited about this kind of research where you don't have to do any damage to the embryos themselves before you generate valuable data. And so we'll have a question and answer session at the end of the session here, but here's my answer. So we wrote the chicken book first, and I'm working on the egg book next. So the egg comes after the chicken. Thank you.
Okay, so what I want to focus on next are some of the specific cognitive abilities of chickens. And we're going to sort of I'm going to echo a lot of what Mark has said, because it's all based on the same sort of principles. So to get an understanding of cognitive abilities, we have to delve deeper into the brain of this animal. So we have to take a look at the gooey matter on the inside. What we have to realize is that cognitive abilities can sometimes be equated with intelligence. And we want to sort of be able to say this species is more intelligent than this species, but we shouldn't, because it's not really a linear scale like that. Because we're humans, though, we sort of disregard that and say there's a tree of intelligence, and look, we're right here at the top because we make iPhones and we're smart. And then, we like to keep things in the family, so there are the great apes. Yes, we invite some of the distant relatives in because they live socially complex lives and they can recognize themselves in the mirror. A few branches down, we might see some more familiar animals. We might see some of our first birds, the parrots and crows, because they have tool use and language abilities. And if we kept going down the tree like this, eventually we might sort of hit the chicken. Now, it's above the slug, but it's sort of below some of these other things. And one of the reasons why I think people think that they are down here is because they are domesticated, and people believe that domestication means that these animals are no longer intelligent. It also doesn't help that these animals are such proficient, producers of food and eggs, that we sometimes think of them just as living factories. Corporations in this country may be people, but factories are still just buildings that produce products. And sometimes I think that's what people think of chickens at the same time. And it's not the right way to think about it. There is no tree of intelligence, and domestication has not significantly altered the cognitive abilities of these animals. Now, if you look at across domesticated species, you will see a decrease in brain size for domesticated species versus the wild ones. And this is the same for dogs and pigs and horses and so on. But scientists have found no difference in their ability to process information, no difference in their ability to learn things between a domesticated animal and its wild counterpart. And in fact, what researchers have found is because domesticated animals tend to be less fearful in their situations, it's easier for us to understand exactly how well they learn, and they seem to learn better simply because they cope better with the tests that we subject them to in artificial conditions. Now, this means, it doesn't make them smarter, it doesn't make them more intelligent, but it makes it easier for us to understand what they're capable of, how they do it, and what they can learn. The chicken brain may be small, but it's powerful, and it's a dual processor of a brain. And it's slightly different from the mammal brain. It's organized differently. If you look at the fleshy, gooey bit on the inside, different parts are called different things. They're organized differently. But ultimately, the chicken brain does exactly the same things as the human brain. It may have different hardware and different software and different operating systems, but it's able to do pretty much the same thing as a primate brain. And there's a good reason for this, and that's because birds and mammals are still subjected to the same type of challenges in their environments. Finding food, avoiding predators, dealing with a social and complex environment, and generally being able to survive and reproduce effectively. So it shouldn't be a surprise that these things function in much the same way. Now, there are apps that are specific to the bird brain, like the bird song stuff. There are apps that are specific to the mammal brain. But generally speaking, we can do pretty much the same things. And as Mark touched on, we have this lateralization effect in the bird brain. So in the human brain, it is still divided into two hemispheres, but there's a connection between those two hemispheres. There's a lot of communication going on. In the bird brain, there's a much more of a keen separation. The two parts of the hemispheres work independently from one another, and that's where this idea of a dual processor comes in. They can do a lot more stuff at the same time than we do. So let's take a look at these eyes, because it has been said that eyes are like windows into our souls. And I think we could pause for a moment and think that's a really nice poetic concept. Unless, of course, they've been plucked out of your head by a chicken, leaving a gaping chasm in your head, exposing your brain matter, at which point it doesn't really work so well. But if we go back to eyes, now the thing about chickens is like mammalian prey species, their eyes are located more on the sides of their heads. It means they have more of a lateral vision, and it's very important because they get to see more of what's going on. But also, because they're on the sides of the heads, each eye can process an image that's completely separate from what the other eye is seeing. There's no overlap of image that they're seeing there. So they have to process two sets of information at the same time. But they also can use their binocular vision. When they're looking at something straight on, both eyes focusing forward, just in the same way that we use our binocular vision. And this visual flexibility is actually very, very important for a chicken when other animals eat you, because you taste like, well, chicken, because it means that you can sort of see things sneaking up on you. And chickens really have this almost a panoramic view of the environment around them. There's a bit of a blind spot right behind their head where they can't see, but with their lateral vision, they get a whole scope of what's going on in their environment and keep an eye on those things. Binocular vision is very handy. It's good for judging distances, and chickens use it a lot when they're foraging for food, and they also use it when they're trying to recognize the features of other chickens around them, when they're trying to tell apart familiar from unfamiliar, dominant from subordinate. And obviously, hens want to steer clear of unfamiliar birds, steer clear of dominant birds if they want to avoid being pecked in the head. And chickens do have pretty much a good ability to recognize other birds, familiar birds from unfamiliar birds, and scientists say that they can recognize up to 90 separate individuals. And to sort of put that into context, that's about the same number of professional contacts that I have on LinkedIn. So that makes chickens pretty effective social networkers, or me pretty lame at social networking, or both. But for the sake of argument, let's just say that chickens are pretty effective social networkers, and move on from there. So here then is our lateralized bird brain. And I just want to show you what Mark was saying in terms of the light coming through for the chicken embryo. So here's the chicken embryo right there in the last few stages of its development, around day 19 to 21. The left eye there is completely hidden, so any light coming through that eggshell is going to hit the right eye, and that light is going to stimulate nerve growth in the left hemisphere of the brain. It's going to cause an asymmetry in the development of nerve cells in those brain. And so you end up with more nerve development on the left-hand side. And so, when we're looking at how they view the world, it is the right eye that they use to discriminate between objects. That helps them find food, discriminate from a pebble from a piece of grain. It helps them track down cryptic but deliciously tasting insect prey that they love to eat. So they're very efficient at finding food, and that's part of the reason that they're so successful. And then when they view the world from their left eye, they're much better at tracking objects in space. Other chickens moving around them, predators moving around them. Where is that object? How fast is it moving? Is it coming closer? Should I be worried about it? And as Mark mentioned, when these vocalizations are given and there's a predator around, they're looking for things with their left eye, and then there's poor old Chuck in the background who's like, what's everyone looking at? I found something interesting here. There is not so much research in terms of whether chickens are left-footed or right-footed in the same way that we're left-footed or right-footed. But part of this asymmetrical brain development might lead to an interesting sort of byproduct, which is when chickens forage for food, they sort of perform this very stereotyped scratching motion. It's sort of a shh, 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 and you can hear it going on, and it's very hypnotic, and sometimes when you're doing a study on chickens, you fall asleep, and you shouldn't do. It was a long time ago, and I'm sure it didn't ruin my data. I'm fairly positive. But usually what people have found is that they often start off this behavior with the right foot. The right foot has a greater tendency of starting off first. And there could be a good reason for this. The right foot is controlled by the left side of the brain. And if the right foot uncovers something, it's going to be spotted by the right eye first. The right eye is also controlled, the image is processed by the right eye, controlled by the left side of the brain. So all of this is being processed at lightning fast speed in the left hemisphere, and it means that chickens can easily and quickly make a decision about whether it's food and whether it should be eaten. And when your prey species is delicious but tends to fly away or bury itself, you want to make that decision quickly so that you're maximizing your ability to forage in an environment. So a very efficient way of processing that information. So when chickens use their right eye, they're often discriminating between different categories of objects. When they're using their left eye, sometimes it helps for them to be able to recognize other chickens and be able to discriminate between other chickens. So left eye, obviously, is the images are controlled by the right hemisphere. And we see the same thing in humans. When we recognize people, when we process their facial expressions, our right side of the brain becomes much more active. So it's very much similar processes happening in both chickens and humans in these cases. But binocular vision is really very much important to the recognition process. And to use their binocular vision, chickens have to be between 8 and 30 centimeters from the thing that they're looking at, which is great because it gets them up close and personal. Not so great because at that distance, people can start pecking you in the head if they suddenly realize that you're someone that you shouldn't be. So how do chickens recognize other chickens? Well, actually sound and smell do play a role. But ultimately they do need to see those other birds to be able to recognize them. And all they really do need to see from another bird is the head and neck area, which I guess isn't too far removed from humans. I don't know the majority of people I know from their knees, for example. I really do need to see a face to be able to do that. Now, the ability to recognize and discriminate other chickens isn't something that chicks are born with, because a chick will imprint on all sorts of objects when it first hatches. These objects tend to have to be moving for the imprinting to work, but in the absence of a hen, a chick will imprint on a boot that's being dragged around this arena, because there's a moving thing. They will imprint on an old man wearing boots and binoculars and carrying a bucket, doing important bucket-related things. They will imprint on a natural predator of chickens, like this killer cyborg raccoon. But chicks do have biases. They do have preferences for what they're interested in imprinting on. And what attracts their attention are things that have a well-defined head and neck area, things that have eyes. So boots don't really have eyes, so they're not sort of the greatest preference for the chicks. And things that move in a biologically predictable manner. And in most circumstances, in natural environments, that's obviously going to be the hen. You've probably heard about the process of motion capture in recent years, and if you've watched The Lord of the Rings, you've probably seen evidence of it with Gollum. Gollum was based on this process where you stick these glowing orbs on, they're not really glowing, but you stick these orbs on animals or humans, you have them run around, you film them, and then it's all captured by a computer, and it turns into a program where you basically just see this point light animation, just the dots moving, and you can use that to make other fancy animations. If you find a willing chicken, you can actually do this with a chicken. You can put these dots on a chicken and video them walking and get one of these point light displays. And what researchers have found is that chicks are just as, have just an equal preference for one of these point light animations walking across a computer screen as they do for a real hen walking across a computer screen. So they don't actually need there to be a hen, just something that moves like a hen for them to be interested in it. But they're not attracted just to random movement. If you take the same number of dots and you just make them move like crazy things on the screen, it doesn't attract them in the same way. It has to be something that moves in a biologically predictable manner. And actually the same thing happens with human babies. Human babies like things that move in a biologically predictable way. Now, anyone who's been mercilessly picked on and pecked at by a specific chicken in a flock will tell you that chickens are more than capable of recognizing specific humans that they interact with. And research does support this fact that, if you have a long-term relationship with these animals, they will recognize who you are. And chickens can distinguish people based on the experiences that they've had with them, positive or negative experiences. I once had a chicken poop in my lab coat pocket. I don't think I've got over it yet. I was holding her under my arm, and predictably, this was the pocket that I kept my keys in. So as I was washing my keys at that time, I thought back to myself and I said, this wouldn't have happened to me if I'd got that PhD on cheetahs in the Serengeti. And then I thought to myself, probably something much worse would have happened to me had I got that PhD. But after that experience, I basically learned two things. Well, first of all, I never kept my keys in my pocket again. But what I did is I developed a generalized fear that any chicken I carried was going to poop in my pocket, which I think is a good fear to have. But I generalized that one incident to every experience that I then had from there on out. And chickens do something similar. So in other words, if they typically have positive interactions with people that they know, when they come across people that they don't know, they are less fearful of those people. But the opposite is also true, and if they have interactions, the people that they have interact with are negative, then they're going to assume that strangers that they don't know are also going to be somewhat negative. And they'll be more fearful of those strangers. So you're hopefully getting the idea that chickens are pretty complex, and they have some pretty nifty little tricks to help them survive. If chickens are smart, I'm afraid to say that human babies are pretty dumb. And if anyone here has ever come across a human baby before, then you're probably aware that for the first 6 months of their lives, they're pretty much immovable blobs of poop and vomit. In comparison, chicks, once they hatch, they're up and at it. They're feeding, they're learning what's food and what's not food. They're beginning to sort out their hierarchies. They're applying their cognitive abilities to navigate their environments. They're very precocial. Take the idea of the physicality of objects, and I'm going to give you a demonstration here. Hold on one second. Okay, so I'm guessing most of the people in this room realize that when I was hidden behind that podium that I still actually existed, that I didn't fail to exist because you couldn't see me. But when it comes to human babies, it takes them 6 to 8 months to make that connection. When they can't see, out of sight for them could potentially mean out of existence. I can't see it anymore. It no longer exists on this planet. Human babies, like I said, not that smart. Chicks figure this out in less than a week, and it's very helpful for them because once they've imprinted on an object, they realize that if that object becomes obscured, that it still exists, and they can still track it down and follow it. And it's very helpful for them to maintain close contact with that. Chicks also pretty good at basic maths. My 2-year-old, not so much. This is how she usually liked to count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 4, 4, 5. Surprisingly, the number 6 has also disappeared recently. I don't know what's going on. Chickens are a highly social species. As Mark mentioned, the more chickens you have in a group, the more eyes there are in the group. And so one way to survive being a chicken is to be vigilant, to spot a predator before it leaps on you and eats you. And so more eyes is good. And there's also safety numbers. The more chickens there are, the less likely it is that it's you who's eaten if someone is eaten. So all of these things, it pays to be in the larger group. And chicks do show this preference too. They show a preference to approach larger groups of familiar chicks and objects rather than smaller groups of objects. And they can even tell the difference between a group of 3 versus a group of 2. So this is pretty fancy. And even if you hide objects, familiar objects behind screens, and the chick's watching, and you take one object from the group of 3 and you move it to the group of 2 so that the chick can see the object moving, but can't see the total number of objects in that group because of the screen, they'll do the basic maths, they'll do the basic addition and subtraction, and they'll still have the preference for the larger group, even though the total number of objects is still hidden. So that's a fantastic ability to use maths. The other benefit of social living is that you can learn from other chickens. You can learn from other individuals. If you see a chicken pecking wildly at something in the grass, an observant chicken can say, I bet there's food there. I bet it's tasty. Perhaps it's something I don't know that exists before. Perhaps it's something new I can try. And so, this social learning can be helpful to finding new patches of food or totally new types of food that they've never tried before, like human toes, eyes and toes. The chickens are gonna eat us all. But what birds learn from watching others kind of depends on who they're watching, or whom they're watching. Chickens learn more when they watch dominant birds performing a task than they watch more subordinate birds performing a task. It's not that dominant birds are any smarter, but it may be that they make the better demonstrators because the subordinate birds are spending all of their time watching dominant birds. Because as a hen, you're more likely to be pecked in the head by a dominant bird than a subordinate bird, and so it's much a wiser strategy to expend your energy watching the dominant birds and ignoring the subordinate birds that are around you. Interestingly, hens don't learn much from watching cockerels or roosters, and it's possibly because they're distracted by thoughts of romantic walks along the beach. So there's lots that you can learn from watching chickens. Sometimes you actually need to ask questions to them to get the answers that we're looking for. And these are the types of important questions that we can ask that give us some information about how we can treat these animals, how we can care for these animals in the sort of the conditions that we put them in to meet their needs. And when we ask these questions, we don't need verbal answers because chickens are actually quite adept at using their beaks and their feet to tell us what the answers that we're looking for if we can design experiments that allow them to do so. And so let me give you a couple of examples of some of the things that we can do. This is a basic preference test that we can test chickens in. And these types of tests allow us to see that chickens prefer to be with familiar birds versus unfamiliar birds. So at the point where the maze splits here, the bird has a choice. Do I approach the familiar bird or do I approach the unfamiliar bird? And they approach the familiar bird. So that gives us a sense of what they prefer. And we can do similar types of tests looking at a chicken's preference for food, for nest boxes, for space, for flooring types, pretty much anything that we like. But the answers that we get from these are pretty basic, because this type of simple test doesn't tell us how important the chicken finds this choice. How important is it to be next to a familiar bird versus an unfamiliar bird? And I can illustrate this. So if I gave you a choice between $50 and $100, I'm guessing most of you would choose the $100. But if I gave you $50, you wouldn't find that a negative outcome. You'd be like, hey, sure, I would like $100, but I'm going to take this $50 and spend it. So I shouldn't assume that just because you chose 100 that you don't want the 50. And that's not a distinction that's made by these simple preference tests. So we have to use more accurate preference tests that take into account how hard an animal is going to work or how much it's willing to spend to gain access to what it's looking for. And if there are costs involved, chickens, like humans, will only choose those things that they really, really want in their environment. In humans, the cost is money. But in things like chickens, we can actually provide natural obstacles that provide a cost in terms of the time or energy that they need to get to the other side. So how heavy a door will a chicken be willing to push through to gain access to food? How narrow a gap would this chicken be willing to squeeze through to gain access to a nest box? And we can also use more sort of artificial approaches that make use of the chicken's cognitive abilities, and in this case, the ease with which you can train a chicken. And you can train a chicken fairly easily. You can clicker train it in the same way that you train a cat or a dog. Good old positive reinforcement, immediately rewarding a behavior that you want to see more of with a treat. So the behavior might be pecking at this bowling pin, for example. And in this way, hens will readily learn to peck at a button or a key or a light to gain access to a reward. And once they've made that connection between pecking at something and a reward, we can see how important that reward is to them by simply increasing the number of times that they have to press the button before they get access to that reward. And this is a very handy way of figuring out what they're interested in. And we found out that they are extremely motivated to gain access to a nest box just before they lay. They are extremely motivated to gain access to a perch or a roost at night before they go to sleep. They want to get off the ground. These are behaviors that are important to them. Not being able to obtain something or do something that you're highly motivated to do can be something that is frustrating. And chronic frustration can be a negative experience. And so this is a good time to start talking about this topic of subjective feelings, emotions. Because having and perceiving these subjective states takes a lot of cognitive processing power. And so we need to look at this from the perspective of a chicken to figure out if they are doing if they're experiencing what we might be experiencing. So this is basically what an emotion is in the sort of a very generalized scientific way. But before we get into the science, what I want you to do now is take a look at the people sitting next to you and look at their faces and ask yourself these questions. Is their emotional world the same as yours? So take a moment now, look at your neighbor. They're not going to bite. Well, it's New York, they might bite. But take a look at their faces and sort of contemplate, do they feel exactly the same way that you feel when you're sad, when you're happy, when you're bored, when you're confused? All these emotional states that we have, are they experiencing what you're experiencing? Because it's very hard for us to tell that, because they are truly subjective states. Yes, we can measure sort of bits of the brain lighting up. Yes, we can sort of look at hormone levels. We can even look at facial expressions, because these are very much correlated to to human emotional states, but they don't really express what you're actually feeling. Only you know what that is. You also have to take into account that many of the people sitting next to you are probably cyborgs programmed to change their facial expressions in order to terminate you more effectively when you're least expecting it. And even Siri expresses some emotional inflections to some of the more asinine and irrelevant questions and statements that you've probably made. So it's very hard to determine what is emotional and what is not. We usually give each other the benefit of the doubt because of our shared humanity. But take a look at this face. It's very different from our face. We don't share similar facial expressions with chickens. And we can't use our own facial expressions to figure out what this chicken is feeling. And so it becomes very hard then to figure out, what exactly is going on in the mind of a chicken. Now, based on research into emotions, much of which I'm sure has already been presented as part of this lecture series, scientists know that birds and mammals have the neurological machinery to generate emotional responses, like fear and frustration and pain and pleasure, things that we're very familiar with as our emotional states. Let me give you an analogy as to what this brain machinery might look like. The shuffle, the kind of crappy iPod shuffle. Now, what the shuffle does is it generates signals that can be converted into music, but it doesn't play music by itself. Lights are on, you're just assuming that those signals are there. And so if the conscious experience of emotions is very much like hearing the sound that an iPod shuffle generates, that this means that many species may generate these emotional signals without actually experiencing that music, without experiencing that rich emotional context that we might experience. So in other words, they have a shuffle, but they don't have any headphones to hear the signals. To experience feelings, you need to convert those signals into music. And the fancier the headphones that you have, the more complex and the more rich that emotional experience can be. Now, with our fancy, giant, bulbous neocortex on top of our head, that gives us a lot of, this is the seat of our consciousness, and it gives us a great ability to process these signals. So it's like us having Bose headphones or Dr. Dre Beats headphones. We get to hear the powerful pumping bass of our emotional experiences, which sometimes is great and sometimes really sucks, because not all of our emotions are great. Chickens generate emotional signals, but they may not experience those signals in the same complex way that we do. So, for example, they might have headphones from a crappy 1980s Sony Walkman, not really the same experience as Bose headphones. But chickens do seem to have emotional responses. Chicks show behavioral responses of fear soon after they've imprinted on an object. And that's very handy for chicks, because it motivates them to stay close to that imprinted object. To turn off that fear response, they need to be close to that. And chicks on their own, not so good at surviving. So having that fear response is critical to their long-term survival, maximizing their survival. Beyond their own personal experiences, chickens also show some evidence of empathy. When a hen sees her chicks undergoing a sort of a mildly stressful stimulus, like a puff of air, the hen responds in a way, from a behavioral and a physiological perspective, that indicates that she might be experiencing a similar stressful situation as well, even though she's not. She's just observing that stressful situation in her chicks. So this could mean that the hen not only has the capacity to identify emotional states in other birds, but also share those emotional states. So, pretty much everything that we've talked about today paints this picture as chickens being pretty amazing animals. And yet, somewhat surprisingly, chickens are not actually defined as animals in the USDA's Animal Welfare Act. And in fact, no farm animals are. And there might be good reasons for this, from economics to politics to everything in between. But it's important that we don't make this distinction between what is an animal and isn't in anything that we do, because if we make this distinction, then we run the risk of forgetting that these animals are more than just egg-producing, meat-producing factories. Chickens are complex animals adapted to live in complex environments. If we believe that chickens are not actually animals, then we might become comfortable with the idea that they don't need to move around a complex three-dimensional environment. If we believe that if chickens are not actually animals, we might be comfortable with the idea that they don't need to use their great ability to discriminate between different types of food and use their visual systems, and instead all they need is a non-stop conveyor belt full of mash. If we believe that chickens are not actually animals, then we might become comfortable with the idea that their strong motivations to perform different behaviors at different times of the day are not important. These are motivations that we can actually measure, but we might feel that they're no longer important and their emotional states are irrelevant. And if we believe that chickens are not actually animals, then we might become comfortable with the idea that they don't need to use their full repertoire of visual abilities to determine who's familiar and who's unfamiliar, to determine who's subordinate and who's dominant in the social environments that they live in. But they are animals, and we do need to grapple with these issues. Anytime that we have chickens in captivity, these are things that we have to deal with. And it sort of brings us back then to this question and to sort of my takeaway points that perhaps you can take away from what we've been telling about why we should care about chickens. Some of these are definitely true, others are still true, but they're true based on my experience. But ultimately, I think we can agree that these animals are fascinating, and whether you add terrifying to that, that's completely up to you. And so while I do suggest that you don't peer too closely into the eyes of a real chicken, in case you lose your own eyes, if you do it sort of metaphorically, they will continue to amaze you because of the sheer complexity of their behavioral responses and their cognitive abilities.
Have a Q&A. One thing I just want to announce beforehand, there is a reception upstairs on the 8th floor. It's $10. We lay out a lot of really good wine and food and beer. If you haven't already paid, you can pay at the door. You walk up the stairs at the end of the hallway there, and you'll come across the faculty lounge where we have everything set up. Now, questions. Here we go.
Two little questions.
One can come up to the mic if you. There's a mic right here, and it would probably be easier because it's
Two little questions. One, what is the natural lifespan of a chicken allowed to live out its lifespan? And also, Dr. Barber, are those images all from the book? Unrelated questions.
So the images, no, are not all from the book, but there are a range of images that reflect what we've been focusing on, so that they're illustrative of those images. In terms of the lifespan, I'm guessing it depends a lot on the nature of the bird. So when you have to remember in chickens there are different strains of birds, and so if you're talking about a commercial strain where it's a meat bird, these birds in their farm situations reach their full weight at 6 weeks of age, and at that point they're so big that they can't even walk around. So for those birds, their natural lifespan is kind of dependent because they've been selected to be so meaty, basically. For the laying birds, again, if it's a commercial strain that's designed to lay 300 eggs in a year, they can deplete their resources very quickly, and it shortens their lifespan quite dramatically. So in terms of an average lifespan for a chicken that doesn't have a lot of these issues, I don't really know the answer to the question. But I don't know if Mark has a sense.
We're talking in the, probably the low teens. That would be a number. But one thing that birds actually share with humans is that per body weight, the number of years that they are projected to live are very similar. Most mammals live a much shorter lifespan per body size than predicted. We are an exception, and birds are too, which is sort of strange because birds live at a higher temperature. They have many more heartbeats per year than mammals do, and yet they are able to cope with all the oxidative stress. And of course, people said, well, they can fly, but a lot of ground birds actually live a long time too. So we're actually doing a lot of senescence work and aging work on birds to compare them to humans.
Go ahead. Right here in the first row. Yep.
It's such a stupid question. Is it true that can a hen lay an egg that is unfertilized? And that's what we eat for breakfast? So we are eating unfertilized eggs.
You do not need a male for a hen to lay an egg.
Okay.
And in fact, a male just gets in the way of the whole process most of the time.
But I heard that a hen lays one egg every day.
So it takes just over 24 hours for the egg to be developed. So it's probably not an egg a day throughout the entire year. But again, depending on the strain, they can lay up to 300 eggs in a year. So and it's sort of constant throughout the year. And this is different from the jungle fowl ancestors who may lay a maximum of around 30 eggs in a season. So they've been selected for their ability to lay egg, and it's vastly and dramatically increased their ability to do that. But to do that, it takes a lot of resources from the calcium in your bones, and the bones become weaker, and so it's a very different lifestyle for a chicken.
So that egg, having been laid, can be collected the next day and eaten that day. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Just another thing to remember is that some of the males actually, even if they have sperm, it's not viable sperm. And so some birds make sure that they, get an extra sperm from somewhere else to make sure that the eggs are viable. And so there's a lot of hanky-panky going on in birds, and we've been using that for, when we talk about mating systems and pair bonding and all that, most birds are like humans, 80-90% of them have biparental families. But if you look at the genetic parentage, it's much more like, 50% of them are faithful and 50% of them are not.
Over here?
Yes, would you talk a little bit about how chickens are treated on intensive farms in the United States?
Sure.
The question is, how are chickens treated on intensive farms in the United States?
Again, there is no one definition of what an intensive farm is. So for laying hens, it could be in those battery cages that I showed, where each hen has about the space of 2/3 of a piece of letter-sized paper of their own in the cage, and they might be viable for 3 or 5 years while they lay eggs. You don't need males for egg laying, so the male chicks are killed when they're first sexed. You have different types of egg-laying facilities. So you have percheries, where the birds can roam freely and hop up and down on perches. You have free-range systems. Each one has its own pros and cons. In the battery cage system, there's less aggression. There's less parasites. There's less concern about the temperature being haywire and the birds freezing to death. In the free-range farms, there's more feather pecking. You might have to trim beaks or toes in order to prevent that, or put those blinders on. The blinders help prevent some of that aggression. The meat birds, again, they have very different lives as well, where they live for that 6 weeks and they're slaughtered, which is probably a good thing, because their bodies can't necessarily support their weight, and their heart and their physiological system can't support their growth as well. But the breeders for the broilers have to live long lives and have to be sort of kept on a restricted diet so that they don't grow too big, so that they can breed the next generation. So are all chickens treated horribly on intensive farms? It's such a broad scope that I'm not going to say yes or no. There are obviously many, many things that are bad from a chicken's perspective, many things that, based on our understanding of their behavior, that aren't taken into account. You heard Mark talk about what they do and their complex way that they do that. None of that gets to happen in a battery cage. So it kind of depends on your perspective of what a chicken needs in that environment.
Hello.
Yes, over here?
I too grew up with chickens on a family farm, and we would get the baby chicks every spring, and they would grow up in the house, and inevitably many of them would be literally pecked to death by their other chickens. Do you know what the reason is for that sort of aggression, even in rather small chickens?
Well, I mean, there are different types of aggression as well. So that, there's pure aggression. Sometimes there's feather pecking. Sometimes feather pecking is not necessarily the same as aggression. It starts off as just pulling those feathers out, and then there's ball patches, and then sometimes by mistake there's a bloody patch, and then chickens go, oh, a bloody patch, and then everyone starts sort of getting involved in some blood pecking, and then it goes sort of downhill from there. But chickens aren't necessarily a nice species. In their natural state in the jungle fowl, it's not all harmony and delight at where they are. So some aggression is just a way of managing their social environment out there. Sometimes it may be that the resources provided to these animals don't allow subordinate birds to get out of sight or find similar resources that they need without coming into context with the dominant bird. So if they have to come to the one area where there's food and the dominant bird is always there, then they're going to get pecked because they need to eat. But if there was food in different areas, they might be able to sort of mitigate that. So there are lots of reasons why, and sometimes bad behaviors get copied. So birds do a lot of socially facilitated behavior, so they're motivated to perform the same behaviors that their counterparts are, that their flock mates are. And so when one bird sees feather pecking or aggression, it can actually stimulate that in the other birds as well.
another aspect of cooperation is to make sure that everybody who cooperates is able to engage in that tit-for-tat kind of behavior. And if somebody is unhealthy, is carrying some sort of parasite, that individual is not going to work well in the group. And when we have this policing of every now and then making sure that everybody is, sort of at the right stage, we call it social contract in animal societies. And wasps do it, naked moreds do it, and chickens do it too. And, when you're not at the roar where you should be, you will get pegged.
You have a question right here.
Yes. Hi. What's your opinion on reverse engineering of chickens into dinosaurs?
The question
I'm
was,
fully supportive of the process of reverse engineering into dinosaurs. I believe that dinosaurs are extremely tasty and lay lots of eggs, so it's perfect.
Birds are dinosaurs, and so there's no need for reverse engineering. They already are.
Thank you.
all right, do we have any more questions? Yes, one right here.
I know you mentioned at the beginning this kind of renaissance about urban farming, and especially here in New York City and in Brooklyn with all the rooftop farms. And I know it's come to a lot of people's attention that it's not as easy as we all thought it was going to be, because they're finding lead and other heavy metals and all sorts of contaminants in the eggs and meat and stuff like that. And I was wondering if you had an opinion on whether or not that's going to be successful or how that's going to impact us.
Well, if you like your eggs with lead, it shouldn't be a problem at all. But, I think the idea of people using these rooftop, chicken barns and coops and things is great. What people don't necessarily realize is it's not going to be any cheaper than supermarket eggs, even sort of the organic ones. It takes a lot of money to set up this process, care for the chickens, and then something goes wrong, you have to fix them, however you fix chickens. And so, it's a great way of learning about the cycle of life. It's a great way of making that connection with these animals. It's a fantastic thing to be able to watch. But it's more of an investment than I think some people realize. In terms of the heavy metals and everything, if you think that none of your foodstuffs have those things in, then you may be surprised.
Okay, I think that we're going to run upstairs to the feast waiting. I just have one question. How many people know or are aware that there were chicken shows? My grandfather used to take his chickens to Madison Square Garden years ago, before in the aughts of the 1900s. They had chicken shows at Madison Square Garden the way they have dog shows now. And people came from all over the country with their chickens.
What were they looking for? I mean, was it an aesthetic?
Aesthetically. Wow. Yeah, it was an aesthetic. No, they had different breeds, and they organized them the same way.
Like the state fair?
Kind of like the state fair, yeah, except that they had them at Madison, yeah.
Was there a best in show?
Good question. I don't know. All right. Again, at the end of the hall, there's a single doorway with some steps, and there is a feast waiting upstairs. Thank you both, Joe and Mark, Joseph and Mark. It was wonderful.